Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today we're going to be looking at sexual violence during armed conflict. What can be done to try and stop it? And then what happens to survivors afterwards? So the reason we're doing this show today is because of a landmark court case. Our digital producer Malika Bilal has more on that.
You're right, it took place in Guatemala. Guatemala made history in February with a ruling declaring sexual slavery perpetrated during armed conflict a war crime. The Zephyr Zarco case was the first time in the world where a domestic court successfully prosecuted perpetrators in the country where the crime took place. Now, the court sentenced two former members of the military to a combined total of 360 years in prison for crimes consisting of rape, sexual slavery, and the murder of indigenous women that took place during the country's 36-year civil war. Now, while the ruling is seen as a positive step in bringing justice to those affected by sexual violence and armed conflict, many are asking what impact, if any, the case will have on those awaiting justice elsewhere. So we want to hear from you. Send us your comments using hashtag AJStream.
So the Guatemala ruling has sparked a global conversation about the ongoing problem of rape in conflict and post-conflict areas. Acts of sexual violence are committed against women and children, and even men. Most cases go unreported and survivors live in silence while perpetrators go unpunished. To help us talk about the impact of this, we're joined by Catrin Schulte-Hillen. She is a sexual health group leader at Doctors Without Borders in Geneva, Switzerland. Nayanika Mookherjee is an anthropologist at Durham University in the United Kingdom. Joelle Davis is Executive Director of Youth to End Sexual Violence in New York City. And Irma Velasquez Nimatuj is a journalist and anthropologist currently working in the US state of Texas. Good to have you here, everybody. Joelle, this is a really hard topic to talk about. It's hard to even tell people the kind of cases that you're dealing with and what you're trying to stop. There's one that struck me, which was about a young woman who was captured by ISIS. Tell us that story.
So this was a young woman. She was captured. Her mother was actually killed in a car bomb one day as her mother went to go get flour from a bakery. So she was living alone with her father. Her brother had been killed. And when her father was at work, she was actually captured by ISIS and she was sold into sexual slavery. Sexual slavery is a huge problem right now in the Islamic State in parts of Syria and Iraq. Young women are trafficked. The UN reported that girls are being sold for a price of a pack of cigarettes. So this young woman was actually trafficked and she was sold and resold 22 times in 2 years. And each time she was resold, they actually would stitch her up to make it appear as though she was a virgin, so she would fetch a higher price. So if you can imagine that she was sold and resold 22 times before she escaped, and for 21 times in 2 years, she had somebody stitching her up. And the circumstances of her capture were horrifying, but what she was asked to do when she was being held by ISIS fighters was horrifying in and of itself. She was actually forced to try to keep alive the prisoners that Daesh fighters would have, or civilians that they would capture, and they would walk them to the borders of other countries, and she would give them fluids and vitamins and try to keep them alive, but just barely until they got to the border. And then when they would get to the border, they would harvest their organs and then sell them and traffic them across to the rest of the world. And this struck me because this is a young woman and she was in her early 20s, and all of this had happened to her where in a matter of 2 years, everything she knew changed, and she went through this horrifying circumstances of being sold 22 different times, if you can even imagine.
See, Nayanika, Joelle said, if you can imagine. None of us can possibly imagine that. But you wrote a book that looked at the 1971 formation of Bangladesh, when horrific things happened to women there. Is there something in Joel's story that resonates with the stories that women told you?
The horrificness of that we also understand and assume about sexual violence during war is common, but at the same time, my argument is about the fact that I look at the post-conflict situation with what happened in Bangladesh by the government, by the newly formed government, and among survivors. Um, the so there, one of the most unprecedented thing in the case of Bangladesh was that there exists a public memory about the instances of wartime rape perpetrated by Pakistani army and local Bengali collaborators.
Nayanika, can you tell us what public memory of wartime rape, what does that mean?
By public memory, I mean there was no silence at all about what happened, about the innumerable instances of wartime rape in Bangladesh, and the most unprecedented thing that happened was just 6 days after the country became independent on 16th of December 1971, the government, the interim government at that time, referred to the women raped as war heroines or Birangonas. And this till now is unprecedented in any instances of wartime rape. So this was a public legislation announced by the government, and thereafter there was a pretty public rehabilitation program as well for the women. So it became a big project which in the government words was an attempt to reduce ostracization and also include women back into the everyday everyday currents of and one of the reasons that was also the case was that there was a logistical reason, that because the number of women were huge in Bangladesh, and so for the new country, they wanted the women back to get them on to the right kind of to be the citizens of a new country itself. So that logistical reason was very, very important. Why actually this unprecedented position was taken by the government, which is little known outside Bangladesh itself. And internationally, definitely, it's not known much.
Right. You know, Catrin, Nayanika was talking about what happens post-conflict. I want to throw something at you via Twitter about what happened during and before. This is Roxanne. She says there is a lot of research suggesting that sexual violence and rape is a deliberate strategy and a weapon of war. It's not just an unfortunate byproduct. She goes on to say it's neither inevitable in conflict nor a side issue, and victims need recognition of this as a harm in its own right. Catrin, I'm wondering if you have examples from your own research of this being used as a deliberate strategy.
Yeah, we do, obviously. I think we can also think back to the situations of the Rwandan genocide of Bosnia, where this came up for the first time, you know, in the international sphere, where we talked about rape as a weapon of war. But let me turn it around a little bit. At the moment, we're at a situation, particularly if we look at contexts like DRC or CAR, where the focus is on rape as a weapon of war. And what we have to think about is that large part of the victims who are raped today in DRC are not part of a military strategy. So it's not a weapon of war, but it's an opportunistic way in a situation of chaos, of impunity, of hatred, of polarization, to deal with each other. And while, you know, I'm fascinated by the case of Bangladesh and Guatemala that the two colleagues are pointing out, and you know, we know what happened with the Rwanda case also, but I think it's important that we keep in mind this distinction to say there is rape as a weapon of war, and we're seeing it in DRC. Just when I was there in December, with a situation, armed group goes into the village, they beat up all the men, they loot everything, they rape the women, they raped like 43 women, then they take them, kidnapped, and make them carry the looted material with them to wherever they want to install themselves, keep them for a few days, for a couple of weeks, rape them, use them as sexual slaves, use them as house slaves, and if they're lucky, they can escape.
So, Catrin, what would happen? What would you need to happen? And this has been going on for, I've heard that story for 20 years. For as long as I've been reporting, I've heard that story in the DRC. The conflict has been going on and on and on and on. What needs to happen for those women, those communities, to actually get justice for that to stop even. Let's forget about the justice, like for it not to happen. We've known about this for decades. It's always happens in a period of war and conflict. This is why Guatemala is interesting, what's happened there with that community. But if you're telling us what's happening right now in DRC, how does that stop?
I think we have to take it further and say, okay, that's the tip of the iceberg that is actually visible. That's what we see. And that's what kind of graspable. But behind that is the same and many more amounts of women and girls and boys who are raped by non-military and not in a military strategy. So it's the whole population in military and out of military. And the way to get to this, okay, obviously justice is part of it, but it's the community. It's an issue where the community has to take a conscience about themselves and about their behavior, and to look at what their future and their girls should be looking at. We can impose all we want, and the justice part is important because when it's part of a military strategy, responsibility is not only individual, it's also institutional. There is somebody who is in command.
Catrin, Joel's nodding. I'm just interested, Joel. What did you want to add?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think sexual violence intensifies and diversifies in conflict, as we're seeing in Syria, but we know, like in places in the Congo, it's not invented by the conflict, it predates the conflict, and the challenge again is to see how we end sexual violence in areas of post-conflict. And we know it's not just armed groups perpetrating sexual violence.
All right, how?
Are using
People are hearing your horrific stories. How? They want to know how. How do we do that? Is it possible?
It is possible, but I just want to point out that it's not just a form of violation that is fitting into modality of understanding what's war and peace, where battlefields are, who's a combatant and who's a casualty. In this context, victims of rape and sexual violence are as much a victim of war as a soldier, but it's difficult because a lot of the rapes, like we're seeing in the Congo, aren't just by armed soldiers anymore. But again, we have to have political will. We need stones in the shoes of people in power.
That's what Nayanika was saying, that political will. Bangladesh had that political will.
We need political will, but looking at places like the Congo, where it's a different modality of a form of violence, it's happening in the family now. You're seeing levels of sexual violence in interpersonal relationships also raising concomitant to levels of violence that's perpetrated that's part of a tactic or an armed strategy. Okay. So there needs to be a community response in tangent with political will. Political will has to be there, or it's going to be a vacuum.
You know, Joel, you mentioned community response. Also, Catrin mentioned community response. Irma, I want to go to you with what that response might look like and why it took 20 years for that response to make a change in Guatemala. This is Ikome, who tweets in, sadly, this could be as a result of the immense class and race divisions within Latin American societies, and he uses the hashtag Guatemala. Irma, why did it take 20 years?
Well, they're nowhere in 20 years. They were 30 years. But I would like to add something about all this discussion, and is the race oppression. It's difficult to understand why is so long this oppression if we not understand that the against indigenous women, women of color, or poverty women live under the structure of the races, oppress too much of all these women, not only now, but generation by generation. In Guatemala, for example, we have 500 of race oppression. And for this reason, in Guatemala, nobody, especially the people that live in the cities and the small elite and the military, so this case, that's why the indigenous women ask for justice, why they demand justice for sexual violence, because this is normal in this country. The indigenous women as part of the thing, not of the person. They live in the lower level of the society. For this reason, it's difficult for the indigenous women, not only in Guatemala, but around the world, to get justice. Also, support and understanding from the elite, from the system justice,
Irma?
and from the other actors.
Irma, I want to show our audience some pictures of the women who you're saying they finally, after 30 years, got some justice. These pictures are remarkable from the courtroom. You can see the pain, and also look at them all sitting here. You can listening to the translation as they go through the case. Would you say that now, 30 years later, with two people who are now going to be convicted, sent to prison, they now have justice? That entire community, is this justice? Sending two men to prison?
Well, it's justice, and this is important, but this is the first case, you know? And in Guatemala, we have a big conflict, and we have many cases. So this is only one, but we need to keep working.
So it took 30 years for one case. Are there other cases that are ongoing? Because these women here, these amazing women, these survivors, in Bangladesh, they were called the brave ones. How many years do they have to wait? Does it matter the length of time, Irma?
Well, I don't think so. This is part of the change of the countries inside. It's part of the change the justice system. It's part to understand how the sexual violence oppress, especially in conflict times, to indigenous women, poor women, women that live in the wars or stay in the war situation. So this is part of the change all the nation. We kind the nation we want. For example, in Guatemala, if the indigenous people, we are more than the 50% of the whole population. We need that the institution change in order to get more fast justice. But this is not easy because the racism is strong, the class oppression also, and the gender oppression also is very hard.
Katrina, I see you nodding there, and there's a question here I want to throw to you from Jamie, who said stopping rape in conflict requires talking about rape in conflict. So then how do we make spaces where people can report and get treatment?
Well, you know, difficult but ongoing. I think the idea is very good to see if we want to do something directly for people, they first have to understand that there's an added value in coming forward. As you know, as everybody knows, one of the big issues in conflict is exposing yourself and saying that you have been victim of rape involves several things. You have to breach geographical distance, go to a place, expose to yourself potentially to more violence. You can be subject to, you know, repercussions of whoever committed the crime against you because they see you at a clinic. So there's so many barriers. The first thing is that people need to understand that rape involves long-term health implications. Because if not, why would you go? If you don't have an added value in going, why would you go? And that's, you know, that's one of the issues that we have to work on with the community for them to understand that if, you know, we can do something for you. We can't promise you that you're going to get justice, but I can promise you if you come, we can prevent you from getting HIV, hepatitis B, unwanted pregnancy, and all of those things, which is very important. If you want people to come forward, you can't expect that people come forward with all this weight. And the ladies that Irma talked about, they have fought for 30 years. They have been stigmatized for their struggle to come forward because it's not an easy struggle. It's not like everybody says, wow, great, you're coming forward. People say like, oh God, what are they talking about, you know? And look how she was dressed, all these things. So for somebody, if you want them to come forward for care and for justice, you're going to have to break down barriers. And there's still so many barriers out there. If the system doesn't work, if protection doesn't work, MSF does not push women or, you know, victims of sexual violence in any of these contexts to go forward because there's no way that we can ensure as an organization that protection is adequately handled and that justice is adequately handled. All we can say is like, you come to us for care, we can ensure you that you'll get anonymous, confidential, and adequate care.
Let me just check in. Let me just check in with Catrin. Let me just check in with Nayanika here. Nayanika, I had a little peek at your Facebook page here. You actually reference Irma, and Irma was a witness in the Guatemala case. What does that case, that idea of getting justice 30 years later for that community, and there should be more cases coming up, what message does that send to other communities around the world who are also suffering from sexual violence?
I think I want to backtrack a bit in terms of addressing 3 points. And
address one, because we're almost at the end of the show, the one that you care most about.
Okay, I think, and I'll do it very briefly, because Irma pointed out something very important about the issue of race and the hierarchies within society. The reason why rapes happen can be about sex, power, chance, conflict, chaos, but also the various kind of racialized differences that exist. And those kind of hierarchies also become relevant in terms of access to care that Catrin was pointing about. So the very access to justice itself for women in a post-conflict situation is dependent on where they are within various kinds of unequal systems which exist after the conflict itself. So justice exists. In the case of Bangladesh, there's been a tribunal in place since 2009, and in fact, in 2012, and there has been some executions of collaborators within Bangladesh. And in 2012, one of the testimonies was of a witness of sexual violence on the basis which was one of the big factors behind.
So Nayanika, let me just check. That goes back to 1971. So a case in 2012 links back to 1970s. So,
yeah, because
so it also took a long time in Bangladesh too.
This has not happened.
Right. All right. Let me just bring in Malika. We're right at the end of the show. Very briefly. Go ahead, Joel.
I just want to say that the process of justice, we all have an underlying common goal, I think, here when we work to ensure that the victim feels like they've been treated justly at the end of all this.
Right.
But the process of justice, it's not confined to a criminal court. It's not simply a matter of the investigation.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you look at something like 2 people being prosecuted for this, being charged with this, it might not feel proportional, but it's really also how we denounce and declare ourselves on this issue, on this phenomenon.
Take your point. Let me just get Malika in before the end of the show. And then we'll pick up in the post-show. Go ahead, Malika.
Well, Joel, you know, there are people online saying that this conversation wouldn't be complete if we didn't mention one thing. This is David. He says we have to start by no longer singling boys out of the victim pool. The boys of war get raped and worse. And we also have a video comment from someone who makes that same point. This is Dr. Tamam. Have a listen.
Sexual violence should be noted to be mainly and predominantly targeted against women, but also against men, against girls, and against boys. Rape is used as a weapon of war. Sexual violence and assault become common, and the victims have no voice.
Joel?
There's a young boy from North Uganda who was raped, and we spoke via Skype, and he was sharing his story with us, and he tried coming forward, and the police actually treated him like he was a criminal because they assumed that it was something that he wanted, that he was gay, and he was discriminated against, and there's all this stigma around men and boys, so there's no data really readily available for you to see on sexual violence in conflict zones that affects men and boys. It does, of course, disproportionately affect women and girls, but it does happen to men and boys. It's particularly violent and brutal, and men just don't come forward because there's a stigma, especially LGBT persons, but you just don't see anybody coming forward because they know that they're going to be discriminated against, and there needs to be a societal change with that to eliminate stigmas that prevents a whole subset of victims from feeling like they're going to be criminalized if they come forward. Victims need to be able to speak out and talk about this so that we know, so that members of NGOs know and the UN know, so we can push for political will and action around the issue, but victims have to come forward.
Sure. You're listening to Joel Davies. He's Executive Director of Youth for End Sexual Violence Organisation. We also have had on the programme Nayanika Mookherjee. She's an anthropologist. Catrin Schulte-Hillen. She's a sexual health group leader for Médecins, Frontières. And also Irma Velasquez Nimatuj. She's a journalist and anthropologist. Thank you, guests, for being with us. We will continue our conversation online at stream.aljazeera.com. See you all there. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Hello again, this is our online post show. We're discussing the long-term impact of sexual violence during armed conflict. So let's get right back to that conversation. So we have Joel, we have Nayanika, Catrin, and also Irma as well, picking right back up there. I know, Nayanika, you had a couple of points you wanted to make, but we only have so long in the main show. What else did you want to share with us?
Well, the one of the things is about the idea of justice. So the idea of justice, while it can be a juridical one, like in the case of the women in Guatemala and some of the cases I've mentioned in Bangladesh, also the idea of justice has to be based on what the women themselves want, and which could itself mean it often is material compensation or various kind of symbolic compensation, whether issues of health, education for their children, jobs for their children, because often they can get ostracized within communities who might not give them jobs as a result. So various kinds of, so it's not just housing, land, as Irma mentioned. So and at the same time, they are referred to as being greedy because they're asking for this material compensation. So it's a kind of a catch-22 situation for women itself.
Yeah.
And also, one thing we need to remember is how it happens in the first place is about the various why the rapes happen is because of various kind of vulnerabilities. In Guatemala, they were raped because their husbands were not available. In the case, one of the cases I know about, a sex worker who is not seen as an ideal war heroine in Bangladesh because she's a sex worker, but how she went to the red light district because of getting raped. She points out that she lost her mother when she was young, and she thinks her mother would have protected her, and she would have never got raped if her mother was around. So there are all these kind of vulnerabilities in people's life trajectories which we need to keep in mind in terms of why then they become the focus of rapes or how they become victims of it or become targets as a result. So I think the issue of justice also has to be based on as documenters, as activists, we need to listen to what the women themselves want rather than imposing our idea of trauma on them or our idea of justice on them. Otherwise, there'll be a double set of injustice towards them.
Right, Nayanika, good point. And we just got a question here kind of along those same lines. This just got tweeted in from Catrin. Catrin, she says, for women, when does war start and when does it end? Sexual violence exists within and outside of conflict. And I see you nodding there, but I also want to play a video comment for you on that same theme of what happens after conflict ends. So this is Amrita.
It's well established that pre-existing gender inequality exacerbates both the risk and the incidence of sexual violence in armed conflict. So institutional reform is essential to challenge these structural inequalities and restore women's security. Otherwise, they will A, be vulnerable to further rights violations without redress, and B, struggle to enjoy other rights to health, access to justice, to education and employment.
So Catrin, how do you go about restoring security after the official conflict ends?
Restoring security, I can't answer to that. I can only give you the fact that what we are seeing in conflict, in post-conflict, is that the number of victims of sexual violence doesn't decrease. It's the profile of the perpetrators and the profile of the victims that change. Age goes down, it's more children, it's more in the home environment. So we're going back to the fact that when you have huge amounts of violence in a country over many years, like we've seen in many of the contexts, DRC, CAR, South Sudan, you do need a community engagement. You need something where people take responsibility for themselves and see what kind of society they want. It's easy to say, it's the most difficult thing to do. If we look at ourselves in each community.
To say something about this.
Emma, go ahead.
Also, we need a strong institutions. I agree with Catrin, but the most important thing in countries after conflict is different institutions. And in Guatemala, for example, after the peace was signed, the violence against women is almost the same. You can see the data every day, and the data show how the sexual violence against women continue. But this is it has a very strong relationship with the conflict. After the conflict, the institutions were the same. They never changed. The justice system was the same. For this reason, we need to wait 20, 25, 30 or more years in order to get justice. So important thing is this, but also new laws, also a strong education to all the communities in different languages. This is very,
I definitely agree.
Irma,
That
it's the same thing that I wanted to say about community, meaning not the community, out in the village, but to say, you have to take into your hand what you want to do with your society. And it goes back to the video clip. It is, from a medical point of view, let's leave that aside. It's all about the role of women, what we're talking about. If a society doesn't value women, doesn't give them a status, doesn't recognize their value, then why should the individual not just turn around and rape them? So there's a big issue in there when we talk about getting from conflict to post-conflict and changing things, where community has to make a choice and choose a leadership that's going to get them onto a completely different level.
Yes, Joe.
Catrin, I agree. Catrin, I agree.
Emma, hold tight for a moment, because Joe waited for you, and I need you to wait for Joe. Joe, go ahead. Joe's being so polite. The women are out talking him. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, if women aren't protected and respected in peacetime, then you're not going to be able to protect them or respect them in conflict like you need to. You do need the rule of law. In conflict, the rule of law is the first thing to go, and that's where you see sexual violence intensifying and diversing. But it also predates the conflict, and like Catrin said, it happens again after the conflict ends. So you need a strong rule of law, but you also need a political will and a consciousness about political leadership willing to change the institutions.
You know what? And that is problematic. If you go to areas where conflict is ongoing, or post-conflict areas, that rule of law, that political will is very unstable. Irma, you're going to get the last word from our guest lineup.
I would like to say something about this. After the conflict, the communities are very vulnerable. They are broken. Everything is lost. A lot of people is dead. So it's difficult. Also, the role of law is broken. There is no exit. There is nothing after a conflict. So we need to start again.
I feel like I have insight, because I just said that, Irma, didn't I? And I'm not even an anthropologist. So thank you so much. I'm gonna wrap up here, because now the conversation is going, we could speak for another hour, but unfortunately we don't have that time. One thing I'm very curious about, Joe, and if you could tell us in a sentence, what happened to the young woman you told us about at the very beginning of our show?
So the young woman, the woman who was trafficked 22 times, she made it out, and she's actually living in a refugee camp now inside Turkey. So for the time being, she's safe, but I say safe, with kind of an asterisk mark at the end, because she's still living kind of in a context of conflict, and she's not reunited with her family. She's living by herself. She is a single woman in a refugee camp where there are also spates of gender-based violence occurring. So it's a really difficult situation, and I pray for the best for her, that she can hopefully find a way to carry on after everything that's happened to her.
It's a very painful conversation to have, but Irma and Joe and Nayanika and Catrin, I really appreciate you being very pragmatic and sharing your thoughts, your expertise with us. Before we go, Malika.
A closing thought from someone whose handle is Making Herstory. They say this needs to be dealt head-on by all of the world's governments, and the generations of hurt caused acknowledged.
Thank you, everybody, for being part of this edition of The Stream. Appreciate it. Take care.